Welcome, everyone. You are in the virtual living room of Globus Books. Globus Books is a small independent bookstore in San Francisco, but we do have a YouTube channel that features a number of shows, literary and cultural, on history, literature, music, culinary programs, everything about the post-Soviet space. Today, we are very excited to greet Yelena Zotova, the author of new book, Wingless Desire in Modernist Russia, Envy and Authorship in the 1920s. I have found that book, or Yelena talked to me and mentioned it, and I got really excited about it because one of the authors she's writing about, Alexander Grin, is my childhood love. And I think he's really underappreciated in many ways. So I'm excited to hear what Yelena is going to say about Alexander Grin's work. However, the main theme of her talk today is envy. And as she wrote to me, envy enjoyed a legitimate status in ancient Greece, where even gods could envy mortals. Judeo-Christian morality imposed a double taboo on envy, first as a sinful feeling, and then as a shameful topic to address. Mentioning envy as a subject of your academic interest guaranteed you social distancing in the hallways of any Slavist conference before the mid-2000s, when first attempts at de-demonizing the sentiment were made by a team of American psychologists. In Russia, the concept of envy changed its status from an unspoken taboo topic to a popular means of ideological defense against the broadly defined West. So today we're going to learn all about envy in the work of Alexander Grin, Yuri Olesha, and Konstantin Vaginov. And we did have a talk about Constantin Vaginov before with Ainsley Morph and Geoff Cibula, and it was quite fascinating. Yelena Zotova is an associate teaching professor of Russian at the Pennsylvania State University. She was born in Odessa, Ukraine, in 1973 and grew up in Luhansk, Ukraine, before she moved to Chicago in 1994. She earned her PhD in Slavic studies from the University of Illinois at Chicago in 2014, having also taken a course in Russian literature at the University of Chicago. She has been teaching Russian language, literature, and culture at various US colleges since 2001, led a student theater workshop, and edited Russian language student almanac at IUB between 2010 and 2018. She also co-taught a Russian summer language workshop for grade 2 through 8 students in Indiana. And Yelena published selections of poetry in Russian in Oblakov Stichach Almanach in Kiev in 2002, and in Interpoesia International online magazine in 2015, and also in September 2019. She's currently working on a number of translation projects, one of them being A Light in the Attic by Shel Silverstein. Wingless Desire in Modernist Russia is her debut in the field of literary theory. Globus Books is a small bookstore. We are located in the heart of a so-called Little Russia or Russian district in San Francisco, and we carry a wide selection of books on all things post-Soviet space in Russian and in English. I will tell you a little bit more about it as we proceed and towards the end of the show. And for now, let's hear from Yelena. Thanks for being here, Yelena.
Thank you, Zarina. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm really excited. I want to say that San Francisco is one of my beloved cities. It's in my heart and reminds me of Odessa very much. And this is somehow relevant to Grin, but we'll get to it. I should probably add one more name to the 3 names mentioned on our poster. And this is the name of the Russian philosopher of the 20th century, Mikhail Mikhailovich Bakhtin, who is essential to my analysis. And This is reflected in the subtitle, right? Envy and authorship. And one of the criticisms I received in the final stages of producing my book was, how dare you to put the sacred name of Bakhtin next to such a despicable thing as envy, which really testifies to my initial statement that, well, envy enjoys a double taboo on itself. Not only it is bad to envy, but it is suspicious to be interested in envy. Every scholar I read in the preparatory stages would say something regarding this problem, how uncomfortable it is to write about the topic, and how you really put yourself on the spot by admitting that this is the topic you're interested in. One really witty author on the topic observed that envy, out of this proverbial 7 deadly sins, envy is the only one that you cannot really boast about, which sets it apart from all others. And yes, so if you sin, you at least want to enjoy it, but there is no enjoyment in envy at all. A very, very brief prehistory of how I got to be interested in the topic. In the beginning of 2000s, I read a seminal novel of the 20th century, modernist and avant-garde literature, Yuri Olesha's Envy, which was published in 1927. And I enjoyed the novel, but I found absolutely no envy in the novel. This was puzzling. Of course, the author narrator would say habitually, would say, I envy, but it is not enough to say it. Show me some envy. There was none from my perspective. Later on, I've learned that I was not the only one confused, and Olesha's very harsh and dedicated critic, Arkady Belenkov, dissident writer of the 1960s, also found no envy in Olesha's Envy. And we will get to the reasons why this might be so. I think that in order to be consistent and at least introduce the names that are already mentioned, I will just briefly talk about each of the 3 authors featured in our announcement, and then I'll go back to envy. So the first name on the list, Yuri Karlovich Olesha, is probably the most known in the West. He was a major modernist author of the Soviet times, whose debut novel Envy stands alone as the first seminal text on the topic of envy in Russian literature since Alexander Pushkin's short drama Mozart in Salieri, which was written almost 100 years prior. And Olesha was the first one who boldly named the novel after the word envy. The events of envy take place in Moscow during the period of new economic policy, during which Soviet leaders selectively applied the technocratic principles of Taylor and Henry Ford in the USSR, causing new norms and practices inspired by the robust American capitalist system to clash with humanistic values of European Enlightenment, cherished by segments of Russian intelligentsia raised and educated before the October Revolution of 1917. The romantic notion of a standalone genius and its symbolist rendition, the demiurge, were by now out of fashion, and envy of the collective toward the individual rather than the individual's envy toward the collective, and sometimes both, inform much of the plot in Olesha's novel, but this fact is glossed over by the self-censoring and confused author-narrator. Konstantin Constantinovich Vaginov, who is now being translated by Ainsley Morse, whom we mentioned a minute ago, was a sporadic participant in multiple literary groups that proliferated during the 1920s, including Nikolai Gumilev's poetic workshop, Resounding Shell, Bakhtin Philosophical Circle since 1924, and OBRIU, Объединение реального искусства, as well as many others. Vaginov's novels The Goat's Song, Козлиная песня, and Works and Days of Свистонов, Труды и дни Свистонова, reflect the intellectual and literary atmosphere of the 20s. We're actually 100 years away from that time. So strange to think. 1920s Petrograd or Leningrad. And the spirit of the Bakhtin circle. In these novels, Vaginov puts grotesque kind of anxiety, puts to test the principles of Bakhtin's Leventary, Желание, and confronts a new and grotesque kind of anxiety which the writer develops in the context of the widespread secret surveillance in the USSR. The so-called author in the novel is compelled to transform into a secret spy as he live enters the hero, following the artistic technique outlined in Bakhtin's seminal but unfinished work «Author and hero in the aesthetic act», автор и герой в эстетической деятельности. And the manuscript produced in the process bears tragicomic resemblance to a sorrow donos, informant's note, in Vaginov's loving yet merciless parody. Finally, Zarina's favorite writer, Alexander Stepanovich Grin, born Grinevsky, came from the lower stratum of Russian society, although he was also a descendant of Polish, disenfranchised Polish nobility who rebelled against the Russian Empire in 1863. Much like the founding father of the socialist realism, Maxim Gorky, Grin held the status of Gorky's protege for a while, but striking differences between their respective outlooks on art and life soon became apparent. Resolutely unwilling to surrender his creative autonomy to the Bolshevik state, Grin spent the remainder of his days in poverty and died of hunger, leaving a wealth of novels and short stories that captivate the imagination with lavishness, vibrancy, and extravagancy of style and settings. In his life-affirming stories and novels, Grin emulates first- and second-rate American and Western European prose he read in Russian translations as a child. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Grin boldly maintained the romantic ideals of the pre-Soviet era, sometimes at the expense of appearing somewhat kitschy. In Grin's soul morbid novel, Jessin Margiana, written in 1929, against the grain of the Bolshevik propaganda, ugliness and poverty are never attractive, while beauty and kindness are sooner or later rewarded with wealth. It's a sort of Cinderella inside out. The Union of Soviet Writers, the official organization that helped writers survive in these years, eventually branded Grin an ideologically alien author and denied him material support, causing his death of starvation. Yuri Olesha wrote, "They say sometimes that Grin emulates Edgar Poe, Ambrose Bierce. How can one emulate imagination? He is not emulating them. He is their equal. He is just as unique as they are." Before we proceed to speaking about these three significant names, and by the way, Grin's Fandango and Other Stories is now being published, has been published by Columbia, as you know, in Brian Karetnik's translation. The last time I checked, Marianne Schwartz remained the sole latest translator of Olesha. I haven't found any new translations, but my feelings are that they may be underway, and we just don't know yet. If you know of one, please let me know. So in my book, I talk about the hermeneutic challenge of envy, how it is the most challenging topic to put in words. One reason is that envy relies on language for disclosure rather than for concealment rather than disclosure, right? And the second part of it is that it is so intimately tied with our sense of selfhood that it's virtually impossible to render envy in any of the three persons without untying the navel of your selfhood. I will be very brief, but just give you an example. So in the middle of 2000s, simultaneously in Russia and in America, there were two works, both a product of collective effort, seeking de-demonizing envy. The Russian work, the Russian collection was called Оправдание зависти or something like that, justification of envy in culture, which implied, of course, that if you need to justify something, it is already bad inherently. And the American collection was that of a team of clinical psychologists who were working in gender and feminine studies, and they explored how envy affects women's position in at work and in relationships, enumerating various techniques the envier may apply, and the feelings of the victim of envy. There are other works too, but basically the initial suggestion of these scholars was, well, since envy is a secret feeling, maybe we can get rid of it if we start openly confessing it. Sounds like a plan. However, it turned out that it doesn't really work, because to say I envy you and mean it in earnest, I envy you, doesn't make your counterpart any more comfortable, right? Now, I used to envy you. Okay, good. So all these years I was under threat. You envy me. Maybe this is my projection. Maybe it is me who is envying. They envy me. He envies them. This is an accusation. And again, any kind of, so no matter how you put it, as soon as you pronounce the word, you implicate yourself necessarily. And this is what all the scholars complained about in their forewords. Another problem with addressing envy in words is that, of course, as scholars of envy in literature and culture shown, envy works under disguise. It can take any kind of noble disguise, such as caring for the envied person, seeking justice, genuine interest, and so on, protection. And there is seemingly no way to tell these genuine feelings from those informed by envy, but masquerading as such. So it seems. The reason I found Mikhail Bakhtin's concept of authorship so helpful is that it, in my mind, it solves this problem of, even though Bakhtin never actually wrote formally on envy, but I try to show in my book that he came up with a model of relationships between the author and hero, which allow us to at least estimate the possibility of the author envying hero and hero envying author. In Bakhtin terms, author, each person on earth is simultaneously an author and a hero. We live in society, we're part of society, we interact. Even when it's COVID-19, we still have multiple personalities in our mind of people whom we used to interact with or plan to interact with, and we live in constant dialogue with other voices. So each time we meet a person, we author them, we are the author and the person is the hero. simultaneously that other person is the author of us, and we are their hero. And Bakhtin explains it in very in spatial terms. For example, now that I'm on Zoom, I can on YouTube, I can see what's behind me. But in Bakhtin's time, that was impossible. So we never see what's behind us, the context, the background. We never, according to Bakhtin, we never see our true facial expression, because right now, as I'm looking in the camera, I'm correcting my facial expression. It's not me, it's me adjusting to the viewer, right? But in real life, only the other person can give us the feedback of who we are, what we look like, what we may be not realizing but experiencing. There once used to be a very popular play called Vagina Monologues, right? I think it's still on. And actresses who trained for that play went through the, they had to train themselves to pronounce vagina clearly without blushing. This is something I had to go through actually saying envy. And when a very prominent scholar in our field, Gary Saul Morson, met me in one of the conferences, he was the only one who was delighted at the word. What are you writing about, envy? Oh, what a juicy topic, said Gary Saul Morson, at which point I was scared and kind of escaped into the corridor. So yes, the topic is uncomfortable, but literature is one tool that helps reveal what's underlying and helps us cope and also recognize our own envy when we think we're doing something beneficial and noble. It provides a very nice kind of self-corrective. I want to introduce maybe an entertaining moment and go back to my puzzlement over Olesha's envy, in which I saw no envy. And I'm going to introduce you to two quotes, which one of them is by Olesha. The other one, you will tell me the author probably right away. So the topic of envy by Olesha is that there is a revolution and there is new kind of elite, the communist officials, the servants of the people, so to speak. And one of them, Andrei Babichev, is the food minister who one day picks up from the street a drunken poet, disenfranchised intelligentsia member, Nikolai Kavalerov. He houses him, he gives him a job as a secretary, but doesn't seem to acknowledge any kind of personal superiority of Kavalerov, which Kavalerov is convinced of. And so Kavalerov slowly grows to be really mad of his benefactor. And one day, drinking beer and eating sausages, he writes him a hate letter in which he says the following, speaking in the third person of his benefactor: who authorized him to oppress me? How am I worse than him? Is he more intelligent, richer in spirit, more delicately organized, stronger, more significant, greater not only by rank but in essence? Why should I admit to his superiority? Says Kavalerov. The benefit of writing your book too slowly is that you come to see the other side. On June 21, 2018, a certain political figure, and you'll tell me who that is, said the following: they always call the other side the elite. Why are they elite? I have a much better apartment than they do. I'm smarter than they are. I'm richer than they are. I became president and they didn't. And I'm representing the greatest, smartest, most loyal, best people on earth, the deplorables. Remember that. I don't know if I need to attribute the lines. As we can see, envy, the structure of these soliloquies are strikingly similar, even though the values listed in them are diametrically opposite. So my discovery, or at least my hypothesis, was that almost anything can be envied. And there are no absolute enviable entities that everybody would desire. Everything has to do with the value system, the hierarchy of values a certain individual holds, and whether or not they align with those held currently in the society. So going back to the supposedly lack of envy in Olesha's novel, Belenkov, Arkady Belenkov, whom we mentioned, said many things are called envy in Yuri Olesha's envy. But in fact, what he calls envy is the sense of violated justice. The Belenkov's conviction was that Olesha was too afraid to openly confront the Bolsheviks, but too talented to hide his real attitude towards the so-called positive hero, the one who, the benefactor, the food minister, right? He paints him in a very unpleasant light, but then pretends that his true character, the envier, has any reasons to envy this person, which is very unbelievable. I also read a Western take on Olesha's envy, which came very early, around 1930s in Germany. A German sociologist, Helmut Schock, who authored one of the major books on the topic called Envy, a Theory of Social Behavior, acknowledged Olesha and praised him for exactly opposite of what Belenkov scolded Olesha for. Schock praised Olesha for being very courageous by admitting to his intelligentsia envy towards these new people. And the reason Kavalerov envies in Schock's mind is that these new people have status, a good apartment, a bed to sleep, paycheck, and so on. Nothing could be farther from Olesha's concept. The main point of the novel is, of course, that it is not about financial envy. Russian poets lived with the idea that they should be unrecognized, poor, disenfranchised, and so on. This was part of the gentleman code. What Kavalerov envies is that the new Soviet man, has a very stable worldview, has a purpose in life, has a place in the society, while Kavalerov's world is in shambles. He lost his sense of purpose. And what he used to view as his strong sides is no longer valued. Everything I say right now on YouTube is just tip of the iceberg. I'm really simplifying and rambling. The book has it in a more organized way. Konstantin Constantinovich Vaginov a person who made it a point of his life not to have a biography. Actually, a more well-known in the West poet, Osip Mandelstam, expressed the same idea in his prose, that Europeans are now deprived of their biographies because life is changing so quickly that one cannot any longer imagine a grand narratives, you know, and Bildungsroman or something like that, that we no longer have a consistent life story. And what now replaces the biography is the library. What you have read in the 20th century is your biography. Vaginov seemed to be of the same opinion, and also he is arguably the predecessor of Russian postmodernism, because in addition to that, in one of his novels, he explained that reading and writing is essentially one and the same process. One of his characters in Works and Days of Svistonov is a writer who kind of compiles his works from other sources, and there is a two-side page in the novel saying Svistonov read blah blah blah, Svistonov wrote blah blah blah, with a little bit of change, showing how writing of historical novels happened. So Konstantin Vaginov was one of the most favorite students of Nikolai Gumilev, but also his rival. He was not a very obedient student, so to speak. And one major event in his biography was the death of Nikolai Gumilev in 1921. Gumilev was arrested by NKVD and shot very promptly. And this becomes a kind of symbolic theme that keeps reoccurring in Vaginov's works in various forms. One interesting thing about this author is that he was in constant dialogue with Mikhail Bakhtin, and there are many questions asked about Bakhtin's legacy and its roots. The idea of carnival, for which Bakhtin is known, might have came from the conversations between him and Konstantin Vaginov. At least they contributed equally. Bakhtin as a philosopher, and Vaginov as this kind of precursor of modern literary criticism, which verges on parody. But this parody is a means of studying, examining the idea, studying the text. One interesting fact that came up while I was researching Vaginov's novels was that normally these novels are taken to be novels with a key. Yeah, when you portray certain people and then change names slightly, but everybody recognizes themselves. One of the leading researchers, Marina Bolgova, introduced an idea, which I don't want to say independently from me because I was not publishing, my fault, but anyway, it becomes very apparent that Vaginov's names are floating signifiers. They tell a story which is different from what the story of the characters under these names is. And one of such names was Pavel Luknitsky, Pavel Nikolaevich Luknitsky, the first researcher of Nikolai Gumilev. Apparently, since Gumilev was shot and considered enemy of the people, Luknitsky could not proceed with his work. And he requalified as a geologist, finally escaped the secret services, which kept harassing him. But he kept the love of the Silver Age and of Gumilev, his idol, throughout his life. Luknitsky appears to be in the novel under a changed name. And I'm going to show you how Vaginov portrays this person, this type, not this person, this type of a scholar. There are two characters in the Goat Song by Vaginov, named kind of comically Misha Kotikov and Kostya Rotikov. And these names, as I have said, have various prototypes under them, and these prototypes switch as needed, while the names tell a completely independent story. But in this particular episode, Misha Kotikov is a first scholar of a certain imagined poet Zaefratsky, Alexander Petrovich Zaefratsky, who is modeled on both Gumilev and Bloch, depending on your optics. And this is the type of research Misha Kotikov conducts on Alexander Petrovich's life. He has catalog cards, which he fills out in Alexander Petrovich's handwriting. And in his handwriting, emulating his handwriting, Misha writes, year of 1908, May 15, Wednesday, 3 p.m. Alexander Petrovich had dinner in Европейское Hotel. At 5 p.m., from Европейское Hotel, Alexander Petrovich went to the Гостиный двор with Evgenia Semenovna Sliptsova, parenthesis, ballerina. He bought her kid gloves and a ring with a sapphire. As of today, 1925, January 5, 6 p.m., Sliptsova is a well-preserved brunette. Her breasts are small, shoulders broader than her pelvis, legs, like with all belly dancers, muscular, and so on. So this is Misha Kotikov had learned everything. How many birthmarks Alexander Petrovich had on his body, and how many calluses. He learned that in 1911-ish, Alexander Petrovich had a furuncle on his back, that Alexander Petrovich liked coconuts, and that he had a hellish load of lovers, but still loved Ekaterina Ivanovna very much, and so on and so forth. So, as you can see, this type of research is more of a police report than a literary scholarship example. And Misha Kotikov finds this information by dutifully visiting all the widows and former women of Zaefratsky, sleeping with them and sort of living the life of his idol, believing firmly that he is continuing the life of Zaefratsky, that he is bringing him back to life this way. This was Vaginov's quite scandalous way of turning Bakhtin's live entering inside out. Misha does live enter Zaefratsky quite literally. The irony, of course, is that Zaefratsky is dead at the moment. And so the whole enterprise becomes kind of eerie and tragicomic. The connection between Vaginov and the Russian expert on envy, Alexander Pushkin, comes through clashing two mutually exclusive myths. One is, of course, Mozart and Salieri, the proto-text on envy by Alexander Pushkin. The interesting moment comes when we ask ourselves how does the author, want to portray him this way. We know he is envious, but how do we figure that he is actually a spy? Pavel Luknitsky, who, like I say, was one of the prototypes, was reported to be collaborating with the secret services, with the Soviet secret services. And this report comes from the KGB general Oleg Kalugin, who in turn defected to the West and kind of unmasked, right, the evils of the regime. So we should not probably take this information too uncritically, but the likelihood and other testimonies of less sort of ominous figures, they point towards the fact that Luknitsky was harassed and kind of forced into collaboration, at least for some time, and that the person he was supposed to report on was Anna Akhmatova, Gumilev's first wife, which actually made him flee Leningrad eventually. The information came in 1990s. Vaginov writes his work in 1924. There is no word anywhere in the memoirs that Luknitsky is a reporter, is a spy. How does this portrait come through? Misha has a vice in terms of Russian culture. He's too hardworking. He's too methodical. Sounds counterintuitive, but if we recall Mozart and Salieri, this is what Salieri is accused of among other things. And of course, we talk about imaginary Salieri, not real Salieri. But the conflict in Pushkin's Mozart and Salieri is between a spontaneous genius, who is Mozart, right, kind of childlike cherub, and this analytical, meticulous, horrible person, Salieri, who envies the spontaneity. Vaginov was able to pull off this trick by introducing yet another myth of envy, or should I say discourse of envy, which was even older, much older than Pushkin's. It was Hesiod's Works and Days, the poem which introduces the ambivalent nature of envy. Hesiod, ancient Greek author, says that envy has double nature. On one hand, it can be destructive, it can be very, cruel and base, but there is also good envy, which prompts you to action, which prompts you to emulation, surpassing your rival, and so on, and causes all kinds of good things. And since Works and Days is about tilling the soil, there are lengthy descriptions of how you should till the soil, what you sow first, and what you reap and when. And some of these plants mentioned in Hesiod reappear in Vaginov's novels. The title itself is recycled for Vaginov's next novel, Works and Days of Svistonov, as we have already said, and so on and so forth. So Hesiod speaks of the Iron Age, where people are at each other's throats, people are not to be trusted, and implores them basically to embrace the good kind of envy rather than reveling in the bad and destructive one. Misha Kotikov, poor Paul Luknitsky, who did not really deserve such a portrayal, happens to fall into the category of the representatives of the Iron Age. He is also a dentist in the novel. Dante, dentist, there is a play on words. He is shown at work how he uses metal instruments to pull out words, to pull teeth out of his client's mouth, but also at the moment he thinks of beautiful metaphors. So it's almost like he's pulling out words out of the mouth of his victim and so on. So it's a superimposition of, you know, допрос с пристрастием, да, this kind of session of inquisition at the KGB room, while also beneficial work as a dentist. All Vaginov's images are, you know, double like that. They are ambivalent with a meaning and depend on the optic. And so it seems that that really Pushkin's model of envy overcomes Hesiod's more balanced view in the perception of a Russian reader. We immediately identify Misha even before we get to the place with these cards. Right away, Misha appears as someone suspicious. You know, too much system to his work. This is part of what we can say about Konstantin Vaginov. Purchase the book and read the rest of it. Before moving on to Grin, maybe I could quickly comment on the photograph that we featured in our advertisement. And this is the historical photo of late 19th century. Featured on the photograph is Otto Lilientari, a German constructor and pilot, and his first glider. And Otto Lilientari is also featured in Olesha's Envy very early in the text, where there was a very interesting translation problem. In Russian, there is a line «Порхающий человек Otto Lilientari убился». The fluttering man, Otto Lilientari, and then the translators pause, because the reflexive verb убился can be translated either as got killed or killed himself. The chapter dedicated to this in my book talks about the ambivalence Olesha experienced with the collective envy versus individual envy. The envied subject never truly realizes whether the envy is his own or comes from the outside. And that is not only because envy is a secret business and self-deceiving business, as shown very well by René Girard, the French theorist of envy, but also because envy quickly catches on. As soon as it sparkled, it starts bouncing between the subjects. It infects the other and bounces back off, and a kind of madness proliferates where the two mirroring minds start viewing each other with suspicion and malice. And so this motive of the undercut flight is consistent throughout the literature of late Russian modernism, and I mean the late 1920s. And in Grin, finally, it resurfaces in the sparkling sparkling world, блистающий мир, in the image of Drud. Grin is really underappreciated, and I'm glad he's coming back to the literary scene. One of the emigre critics, Gleb Struve, called him a third-rate Stevenson, kind of meanly. The modernist yearning to overcome Earth's gravity takes a peculiar form in Grin's novel, The Sparkling World, блистающий мир. And now I see a typo, okay. Written in 1921-23. The novel's protagonist, Drud, does not need wings to fly like a bird. The first performance of his talent in a local circus causes panic in the audience, and two secret police agents attack the hero with a knife as soon as he steps out onto the street. So again, we have this motive of secret police being ever present. Predictably, the attack fails. Drud soars up, and one of the assassins, unable to sustain his grip on the hero's forearm, falls to his death from a great height, as if in a scene from a Hollywood movie. Drud, and I quote Grin here, Drud swept alone over the city lights, furiously and triumphantly, recounting the details of the attack. A snake dashed the eagle, he thought. At the same time, he fully realized that he presents danger to the townsfolk's peace of mind. Thinking back to his conversation with Grin in his diaries, Yuri Olesha writes, When I expressed my delight to Grin about this superb topic for a fantasy novel, a flying man, ! He was nearly offended. This is a symbolic novel rather than a fantasy. It is not a man flying. It is the soaring of the spirit. They say sometimes that Grin's writing is an imitation of Edgar Poe or Ambrose Bierce. How can you imitate inventiveness? You'd still have to invent. He's not imitating them. He is their equal. He is just as unique as they are. So we made a full circle. Known first and foremost for his fairy play, Feria, Scarlet Sails, or some translate Crimson Sails, which, quite contrary to Grin's will, came to be interpreted in the 1960s and until the late 80s as a kind of a red Cinderella. Grin enjoyed the status of a cult writer in the USSR between the 1960s and the late 1980s, and made a second comeback in the mid-2000s. Nonetheless, with the exception of a few scholarly enthusiasts, Western academics largely ignored Grin as an author of just one consequential work, which was viewed as a kind of sappy story for adolescents for quite a while. This view has been challenged by Natalia Oreshchuk in 2006 and by Barry Sher in 2020, where Barry Sher actually had to fight with his younger self. The paradox of Grin as a writer is that while openly admitting his indebtedness to first and second-rate Western adventure novels, he emerges on the Russian literary scene long before the revolution of 1917. So he's older of the three and very prolific. He was an independent artist with his own unmistakably unique voice and remains until his death of starvation proudly unengaged with the communist regime. Grin started as an author of short stories about revolutionaries, SRs, socialist revolutionary terrorists, and so on. And that didn't seem very exciting. But in 1909, he wrote the work that he himself considered the beginning of his career. The work was called The Island of Reno, Ostrov Reno, which was the beginning of the Grin as we know him. As Korneliy Zelinsky famously called his artistic world, Grin created Grinlandia, not Grenlandia, but Grinlandia, the land which has never existed, but in which we recognize the shape of the landscapes of Crimea, first of all. And as Oreshchuk shows in her research, Grin has been commodified as a kind of the ghost, the spirit of the place, the spirit of Crimea. And when in 2014 the unidentified Russian troops entered the peninsula, Grin was under banners, metaphorically. The journalists who wrote apologetic articles congratulating Putin on annexing the peninsula were praising him for saving this Grin's place for Russia and saving this beautiful piece of land. One of the journalists imagined herself as Grin's female character, as Sol, and photographed herself against the Scarlet Sails and so on, kind of positing for for basically invading this world with a political agenda. This is what Mikhail Bakhtin called parasitism in his work. As I have said, Bakhtin never really conceptualized envy, but if we come to think of the nature of existential envy, taking someone else's place and living their life for them while discarding yours, this is pretty much what Bakhtin meant, reading a novel and identifying with the characters in a kind of self-serving, consumerist way. And this is what happened. Even more interesting to me as an envy scholar was the celebration of this event in Russia in 2015. Several major cities, including Moscow, of course, had gatherings of people who, again, praised the Crimea's return home to the metaphorical Soviet Union with the identical posters. Crimea is ours, Krym наш. Obama, do not envy. It was still Obama's time, right? And I was just amazed at the thinking process, because Crimea is ours, okay. The reason for that was clear, but why should Obama envy Crimea was absolutely, a mystery. But obviously it was, it was a big thing. It was replicated in many marches. And my kind of conclusion was that having rediscovered Olesha's novel in mid-2000, around 2004 to 2005, Putin's second term, the Russian readers realized that the story is really about the clash between American and European values on Russian ground. This was exciting, right? And so this topic, received kind of a new life, a new incarnation. And now envy became this kind of catchword, which was a very convenient excuse for any kind of criticism. You don't like what our military troops are doing, you are envying us. You don't like, lack of human rights, well, that's because you envy, and so on and so forth. It was, of course, very unfortunate that Grin's land of escape, where he really hid from the all-seeing eye of the Soviet police, was now taken back under that same wing. The main thing I wanted to say, maybe in conclusion, about Grin is that traditionally he is his legacy is viewed in a very skewed way. The Scarlet Sails, which is again the red, yet another red Cinderella, if you wish, speaks of the fulfillment of the wish. It's a profoundly symbolist work, of course. On the surface, it is about the two star-crossed lovers, but there is a deeper meaning about a soul meeting the Lord, maybe, some spiritual closeness, that follow your dream and it will come true. And his late novel, Jesse and Morgiana, which I mentioned in the beginning of this talk, is very strange. It puzzles every researcher. They say, well, this is nothing like Scarlet Sails. There is no hope in it. The have-nots remain have-nots and haves remain haves, obliterating the fact that this is a biblical, a statement in the Gospels. Those who have will have more, and those who don't will lose, if we talk about the spirit. So when I read Scarlet Sails and a very bright, right, almost childish story in a way, with alongside this very gothic and dark Jesse and Morgiana, I found affinities between Grin's treatment of color red, scarlet. He makes it a point, even as early as in Scarlet Sails, to say that the protagonist, who is looking for red material to put on the sails of a beautiful ship, which is supposed to come and pick up his beloved, that this color red has nothing to do with the political red, or Grin adds, I would say sectarian. So he brands the Bolsheviks as a sect quite openly. In Jesse and Morgiana, there is an idea of spiritual thirst, alchemist. And if you read the two works together, you realize that when the hero lover in Scarlet Sails is looking for the correct color of red to put on the sails for his bride, he does it very much in the way an author would choose the correct word out of multiple of synonyms. He literally showers us with synonyms of red, scarlet, crimson, purple, burgundy, and so on. And then he finds the correct one, Ali in Russian. And a similar process is portrayed in Jesse and Morgiana when the heroine, who was poisoned by her sister out of envy, survives and comes back to life. Grin upholds this idea of envy as poison, a secret poison, put in a beautiful bottle, which attests to envy's secrecy, and to the need to overcome the envious urge with the creative power. It is often said, when we talk about Bakhtin, it is often said that Bakhtin made one mistake in that he created this ideal author, but this author tends to be, too authoritarian. This is the common critique of, maybe the hero doesn't want to be portrayed necessarily. My contribution to this debate, I argue that this criticism only stands if we assume that the author's position is the enviable one. But isn't it true that deep down inside, what each of us desires is not as much to be the author, however authoritarian, but to be the hero in someone's eyes, to be seen, acknowledged, recognized, and portrayed in a favorable light. The problem is, of course, that when we imagine this enviable fate, we also take over the other and tell them how to see us. You should see me in this particular way, rather than trusting the other to form their own portrayal and return it to us as a gift. And this is basically a very brief and inaccurate summary of the book. I hope you were interested.
It was absolutely fascinating and thought-provoking on every single layer I can think of, politically, philosophically, and literary. Thank you for this richness. And I know throughout the talk, Olga Merson has been making notes that also look really, really interesting, and I want to get to them too.
I had some questions and some kind of thoughts in the wake of your talk, both of them. It occurred to me that Kavalerov's name is kind of a typical bourgeois label for a nobleman.
Yeah.
So you have this kind of double prism there, because it means a chevalier.
Yeah, yeah.
And yet it's kind of stolen. The intonation of admiration is stolen from it. So it no longer refers to a gentleman, but to a gentleman seen through the eyes of a Philistine.
Mm-hmm.
So whose envy, anyway?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because this label kind of flips those things.
Mm-hmm.
I found that very interesting, because it is a very tiny onomastic solution. We look at this character, although he's supposed to be the speaker, we look at him through the eyes of someone who, to begin with, disapproves, probably envying him from a Philistine position. So you have all of that polyphony, kind of shift of point of view, constantly present in the name itself.
The word Philistine itself is being negotiated in the novel, and yes, the meaning is changing, so it is appropriated by both sides. Philistine, what is the Philistine? It's no longer clear. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but to what extent? In other words, there are problems with that.
Yeah.
Too.
What does it mean?
How we have labels designating the labeler as much as the label.
Yes.
Probably even more.
Absolutely.
And in this case, implicitly, it kind of puts a wedge between the author and the narrator.
Mm-hmm.
Very much so. And I don't mean Cavalier, but the implied, the authorial figure within the novel. Another thing also has something to do with onomastics. Mm-hmm. And this is about the mixed and re-synthesized prototypes in Vaginov. Mm-hmm. You mentioned a couple of Silver Age figures that were very important. It seems to me that Billy is one of them too.
Yeah, sure.
Partly because of the Kotikov and Kotik-Letaev, and partly because of Biely's own relationship with Kotik-Letaev, to what extent is he a synthetic prototype. Mm-hmm. Plus, of course, there are some interesting synthetic prototypes to Biely's most famous novel, Petersburg, and it also entails and they are synthetic because they shift.
Yeah.
They do not correspond to the Roman Aclet. They keep shifting. But another important motif there is double agency.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the most important motif for your topic may actually be class envy. Mm-hmm. Class envy is an impetus for revolutionary activity. Mm-hmm. There is an undercurrent of it between Dudkin and Nikolai Apollonovich all the time. And Dudkin is a true sufferer. He doesn't look ridiculous ever. Mm-hmm. But this as an actual motive, not motif, but a motive for the revolutionary activity seems very interesting. It within your vein of approach, you know, it could work a lot of wonders. Then a couple of questions about Grin. It's interesting that some of the hostile comments about Grin actually pinpoint this constant need to reappropriate him. The most famous or infamous one is by Akhmatova. Mm-hmm. That I don't get what language it is translated from.
Yeah.
So he creates this alternative reality, which is above geopolitical borders, kind of archetypal, and some people even find it trite because of that. or not in too good a taste. But as a result, it's kind of ironic that he is constantly co-opted and appropriated or commodified by political forces. Like Crimea is ours because we have, to paraphrase Dostoevsky, the universal responsiveness in us.
Yes.
So to what it raises the question, to what extent is an author who actually either politically suffered or was apolitical or both, is responsible for such abuse? And it's not only about Grin, it's about both Dostoevsky and many others as well. And as well as about misunderstanding. You know, you always risk it with polyphony. And I find this to be one of the most fascinating things that follow from your book. You don't have to include it there, but I'm interested in, you remember when I had to review it, I was interested in where it pushes me.
Yeah, yes.
Which is the best use for any book anyway. But I just found all of these to be so germinating of thought. It's very interesting also that it introduces an important topic of the connection between envy and projection because of the Obama не завидую and all of that stuff. But somehow, you know, it kind of betrays the ones who claim that politically their position is enviable.
Yeah.
They ascribe their motives to the other part, to the other side, which I found to be very
amusing.
But to begin with, the irony is that the intent of Grin was to create an alternative reality.
Yeah.
Something that would supposedly be invincible to political strifes or political contesting.
Yeah.
But it seems that actually made him a very easy, not target, but tool for achieving, for trying to appropriate him as a national symbol. So I found that to be very interesting. I also had a question, a really straightforward question. You mentioned very early on an American collection of feminist psychologists on envy. And I was wondering, I don't know the book, I was wondering if they treat a woman-to-woman envy as a separate phenomenon.
Yes.
Especially as career women work, because there's certain, you know, if they address what is commonly called cattiness. And my reasons are partly feminist, but partly very personal. I've been
I hear you. They do, and there is also another term. I think it's called, oh my God, Queen Bee or something like that. This can even be exemplified a little bit by Akhmatova. Akhmatov's poem, I taught women to talk, how can I now shut them up? So yes, and this problem exists, and I'm not sure, but to the best of my knowledge, this is one of the first works which challenges the question itself, that it is not that women are specifically envious, but women being forced into position of oppression, that they take this out on one another. I mean, it's not such a new technique, actually, if you think of the policy of, you know, divide and conquer.
Yeah, any minority has an internal.
Yes, it's applicable to all such situations. That that you first, you know, you create an oppressed layer, and then have them figure it out between themselves because you're out of their reach. Yeah, this is in the book.
Because it seems to me that it may be parallel to the position of the Soviet intelligentsia as well.
Yes.
That this is actually very relevant for
Europe. Yeah. This is why I never, like I say, when I talk about Luknitsky, I do not want this to be taken as if, you know, I am accusing him of anything at all. And Akhmatova actually officially made peace with him in the 60s.
Another question that I had was kind of half historical, and it gives me some problems because you were working a lot on Grin. What do you think about Corneliy Zelinsky? It's a very sore spot for me. That's why I'm asking.
Yes, it is a sore spot.
I know that Akhmatov was particularly scathing to him, but
it is a sore spot, and I'm not. I'm not prepared to comment. Except that yes, this is the tragedy of the time, that we had talented people, performing deeds that they wouldn't be proud of.
I'm interested in the context of your talk, in the view of enviers as victims, not only the envied ones.
I'm sorry, Olga, can you expand a little bit for our viewers and put it in the context, because people might not know all the details? And
well, I don't know how far I would like to go into it, but there was a whole pleiad of critics who believed the only means of survival was to chime in with persecuting some of their most gifted contemporaries. And he was one of them. A very gifted person, a very tragic figure. Is that it's an important example of kind of creating a culture. It's like putting a lot of people in a glass jar and watching for them to begin to behave like spiders. You know, so as an example, I think it's very important for our understanding of the role of envy in the Soviet intelligentsia culture. That it's actually a tragic situation where like the worst is brought out in comedy, partly not because of career questions, but out of sheer fear.
I would also add here that and sub part of that fear is what we now call the Stockholm syndrome. And the same, so basically this question is applicable not only to Grin, right, whom Zelinsky kind of immortalized with this Grenlandia idea, but also this is the main concern for Vaginov, right? He asks to which extent the ability to read and interpret texts makes you, a dangerous person, and puts you in line with the official sort of party. But also in Olesha, we know the tragedy of Olesha, who genuinely tried to embrace the ideology and basically wrote a horrible letter about Shostakovich, claiming that he is speaking from Leo Tolstoy's position. That Shostakovich is too complicated, and this would be very innocent had not there been a context that your utterance in the Bakhtinian sense is serving a purpose. And this is not just purely academic interest. It will affect the life.
The problem is that it may not be purely academic, but it does shape your own mind.
It does.
I mean, one does get accustomed to think in the terms one is forced into. As we call it, kind of analogous to the Stockholm syndrome.
Stockholm syndrome, And Grin talks about the same thing in Fandango when he speaks about. This is, I think, even the kind of an echo of St. Augustine's thoughts when he says that a doll looking just like you replaces you and tells you that this is what you are, right? When the voice of conscience is kind of silenced out of fear or out of hunger, a doll in your liking is acting in place of you. and that it is a very easy way, all right, of kind of survival, very easy and obvious choice, which is very difficult to refrain from. So yes.
Yeah, I was interested in it also partly for feminist reasons, because there are all sorts of testimonials by prostitutes who said, people ask them how you do it, and they say, it's just not me. I can tune out about it. Because, you know, the commodity is my body, so I want to get as detached from it as the others do. And there's, I mean, the analogy, of course, between that and Soviet critics has been drawn way before us. But,
well, too obvious.
But I'm interested in the internal tragedy of these people, just as I'm interested in the internal tragedy of women who sell themselves. You know, so it's not judgmental. It's not a question of labeling people like Zelinsky, but it's part of the culture that replaces you with your own double from which you can detach.
Yeah, even though we can think of Thais Afinskaya and other heteros, right? The business wasn't always dishonorable, right? So it depends. It depends.
There's a big difference between men describing these testimonies and these testimonies
and the internal. Yeah, I actually read it. I like how Zarina, thank you. Zarina wrote right away to me. It never goes as planned. Let's do it.
Okay, I'm shutting up. Okay, fine.
I love it. So yeah, I mean, we've been talking about white dead men. Come on, let's have. I read some testimonies of prostitutes of today, and some of them are actually quite proud, and their testimonies are similar to, you know, the experience of flight attendants, for example, who and of course there is an element of exploitation, right, of female body. But one thing we may not realize, keeping in mind, passengers, these fragile creatures can knock you down in 2 seconds. And this is a skill sexual workers also possess if they're worse, the assault. They're often being assaulted. They work in dangerous conditions. They don't know what awaits them. And they're prepared to defend themselves without any kind of weapon. So it's an interesting, you know, it's a separate topic, but very fascinating of how you choose such a risky job.
I would like to chime in here because I actually happened to work in a BDSM dungeon as a dominatrix.
Wait, you worked as a dominatrix?
Yes, and I wrote a novel about it, so I can bring a different point of view to this discussion. And I feel that it could be a subject for a completely different talk that I would be happy to host. I think that we, in the last 5 minutes, simplified our conversation. Generalizations about
title, sister, title.
The stereotypes.
The title of the novel.
What is the title of your book?
The title of my book is We Monsters, but when we turned to discussing sex work, it didn't meet my expectations of our Globus discussions. It requires a little more research and a little more depth. Whether we want to compare the critics of Stalin era or Lenin's era or the late Soviet epoch to the sex workers is also a good question. I would be very hesitant to do that for various reasons. And the other explanation that I feel like we owe to our English-speaking audience or audience that I know we have that is not as widely read in the period that we are discussing is that obviously there were some specifics to the literary life in the Soviet Union, and that what Yelena and Olga were addressing in very fine details, because obviously both of them are expert on the subject. And what I want to add as a host of Globus literary programs, very often when we speak of the poets and authors of that time, Silver Age poets or later authors, we find out that they did not leave this world from natural causes. There's always a tragedy involved. And actually, in a few conversations that we had with some poets and translators, and publishers, we were debating whether it's worth discussing the author's work in the light of their life and personal tragedies and circumstances or not. And it's probably worth mentioning Barth's The Death of the Author essay. Do we need to look at the literary work through the prism of what we know about author's life? Or do we as readers leave layer by layer and read it through from our point of view and project, again, speaking of projection, our own world and desires on this work? And there were very interesting points of view from, say, Matvey Yankelevich from Ugly Duckling Press, or Nina Kosman, who translates Svetaeva. For me, it's very symbolic because this is our last event, literary event of this year, of 2020. And it just shows us how many topics, how many questions are there to be discussed, and not just for the sake of talking, but for the sake of thinking, for the sake of continuing the tradition of critical thinking that I think is probably the part that represents the Russian literature the best. Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov, they're all thinkers first and foremost, and even our poets are thinkers. So there is a whole field that we will leave open. And this is not my closing statement, by the way, because we still have questions. I just wanted to offer my 2 cents on this last discussion, a little bit of a context, historical context for your particular discussion, and switch to the YouTube questions. We have a question from Adrian Wenner. I'm still confused why you think there is no envy in envy. Didn't you just say that Kavalerov is envious of Babichev, Makarov, and so forth?
Yes, when I thank you for the question, it's easy to answer. When I said I found no envy in it, I was describing my initial reaction. I do find envy, but not the kind of envy Helmut Schock described, not financial envy in any way, right? It's existential envy. It's the envy goes both ways. And in case of Kavalerov, the envy is existential because his world is gone. While Babichev seems to have adapted to the new world and comfortable by kind of sacrificing values that, come to think of it, they both shared, as both have origins in the old world nobility, right? So Kavalerov kind of envies Babichev's ability to just forget the past and roll on. No, Kavalerov cannot do this. His love is too strong to the old world. That's one of the answers.
There's another question from Tatiana Dzadevich. Is envy the universal human emotion, or the early Soviet years foiled the reflection about envy with some specificity provoked by the time people lived through?
Yes, so there are 2 parts to the question. The first one has to do with my earlier statement about the hermeneutic challenge of envy. Well, common sense, right, dictates us that if we are humans, then we have all the human emotions. And there are even proverbs and sayings that envy is older than the world, and so on and so forth. From Darwinian point of view, envy is what keeps us alive because we are competitive. René Girard also tells us that, well, envy is a tool through which we learn, because we learn to desire the correct thing from somebody else. And basic desires are very limited, food, shelter, even sex is already questionable, right? But everything else that we learn to desire is part of culture, and this is what we learn from others. We want to be, right? To emulate or surpass them and so on. So the challenge of saying for sure whether every human on earth is envious is real, because even if we exclude self-deception, let's say we have a person who is supposedly saint and they are not aware of their own envy, and they never express it, never act on it, so we never know if they ever experience this. But surely it is very common, and even the most virtuous people have moments of upsurge of envy. As far as the specifics of Soviet envy, I tried to explain in the book. The other part of envy, hermeneutic challenge, is that flipping signs does not really change anything. In other words, it has a protean nature. It's the desire to take someone else's time and space and place. And I think the most cunning aspect of the Soviet envy, if you wish, was that intellectuals were put in such a position that they got used to being exceptional for unenviable things. This is the reason why Eastern European immigrants find it so difficult to adapt to the Western world, for example. I will not say for the rest of the world, but definitely when we come to America or in Europe, I guess it's a bit easier, but still, when Eastern Germans reunited with Western Germans, there was a similar problem, that this learned helplessness, right, multiplied by expectations, right, of respect and revere for being exiled, for being persecuted, for having lost what you had, become kind of self-sufficient values. And very often when you restore the person's status, now you have money, now you have where to live, now you are not persecuted by the police. The question is, what else is there to your personality? What are other virtues, real virtues that you have to display? This was a trick. And I think this was the product of the Soviet system, that it was very easy to lose substance because just being persecuted already made you a hero.
I agree with Yelena that this is a very complex reality that we're dealing with, the Soviet reality, and all feelings get warped and in some way like in a distorted mirror chamber, as probably in all the other eras as well. And perhaps it would be interesting to have a psychologist on the panel to address that from yet another.
I actually wanted to express my personal gratitude to Olga, and we've been in contact even before this show, and Olga's feedback is immensely valuable and propels my thought further, and I'm really grateful for all of her contributions, and I have new ideas now as a result. So this was a very good dialogue, I think.
In the sparkling world, Druid is more like a Zarathustrian figure.
Yes.
The whole is very Nietzschean, and to read it as a cheap detective story or whatever sci-fi is probably, well, not a wrong reading. There is no such thing as wrong reading, but a very different reading from mine. Let's put it this way.
No. It's Zarathustra and Nietzsche are in the book.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
By the book.
Even as a very young
Absolutely.
person, you catch upon it. Even in the tone. I mean, it's a fable. I mean, I would define the genre as a fable. You really enter the world that you never entered before, and you'll never enter again. And you like it or not, but you'll never see anything like that. And also, when you were talking about Crimea, that whole thing as a political journalist, for me, that I miss that, actually. And I was writing about a lot of propaganda used during the invasion of Russians in the Crimea and the occupation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. One of the reasons perhaps why they appropriated Grin is because in Koktebel, in Planirskaya, where Grin used to live, sometimes in the late 70s, early 80s, they shot a cult film, The Scarlet Sails. And so people associate the film with Grin and with the Crimea, and it all turned into this one symbol that everybody wants to have for themselves. And in one of her comments, Olga noted that it's ironic because Grin was creating the world that wasn't recognizably Russian. His name are westernized, the cities have Western English sounding or sometimes Portuguese sounding names, and it's certainly not the world of, or the circumstances of Russia at the time or at any time. So that is interesting, this like third level appropriation. And I can only recommend to our readers to take a look and do some exploration, whether you read Russian or English. These books are available, now available in translation. Some more are forthcoming. Vaginov is a very interesting author who became, I hear, an occult author for the Slavic scholars in America. He has more weight here than back in Russia. Correct me if I'm wrong, but your average reader in Russia doesn't run to the shelves in Globus asking for books by Vaginov, I can tell you that. And Olesha is also a very interesting example of author from the time of when the revolution happened, and that reflects the mindset of somebody who's trying to adjust. I will give mic back to Yelena for some final words, but I can only thank you profoundly for this truly fascinating talk and discussion, so thought-provoking and rich, and opening the door to the next year, to more possibilities. And the subject of envy is today, with everything that we have politically happened in this country, it's a burning subject for some people.
Yes, thank you, Zarina. I have two comments. So in response to Olga's notion, and she herself voiced this opinion, right, that Grin was trying to create a Neverland, but ended up appropriated. This can be solved, partially at least, with the famous joke, because everything is a joke these days, that Russia has always been obsessed with finding the Russian idea, right? Thank you, Dostoevsky. Actually, thank you, Chadaev, but Dostoevsky mostly. And lately, it has become a commonplace to joke about the Russian idea, that the Russian idea is to escape Russia, immigrate. That's the Russian idea. Funny, but there is some truth to it. I actually just taught a course on the Russian universal responsiveness, this course of that called The Longing for World's Culture, where we looked at various texts which dealt with this claim to being universally responsive, larger than the world, understanding everyone, and on that pretext, also occasionally incorporating other territories. But that's, don't look at that. That's a minor detail. But yes, I think Grin appealed, of course, to literally imprisoned Soviet readers who were not allowed to leave the country by this, very tangible, very vibrant, live dream of living elsewhere, living the life of your dream. In that sense, I see how everyone wants to, claim Grin as their own, even though he did not actually intend to accommodate anyone's desire. And I want to say that, of course, before the talk, I promised you some unpleasant things on Grin, and I didn't get to it. But I must say, one reason Grin was not readily available in English translation is that as a naive consumer of Western literature, he also uncritically adopted all the Western biases. His works are obviously sexist, at times racist. And the reason we still come, and some of this criticism is in my book, but the reason we don't discard Grin and still come back to him and something valuable and something underestimated is that, yes, his intent was to overcome the limitation of his own education, of his own time, of his own political predicaments. And I think just the fact that this man died of hunger but did not sing the song of the ideology should redeem all his shortcomings, and he deserves attention. And as an artist, of course, he is a superb artist, which brings you pleasure. I wanted to restore some justice to Vaginov's scholars and readers. One of the key names in Vaginov scholarship is Anna Gerasimova, also known as Umka, who is an acting rock musician, but who started and never quit her career as a literary scholar. And she is one of the persons who discovered Oberiu and Vaginov and Vidensky and Harms. And she was not alone. There were other scholars around her, but she is the one bright example of how you can actually be a scholar and at the same time not be boring, but be courageous and creative at the same time. So it is not true that Vaginov is known better in the West than in Russia. I don't agree. It's just Vaginov is poorly known, period. For the Russian scholars, they did a lot to preserve his name. Tatiana Nikolskaya, Sergei Kibalnik, and so forth. Earl, who passed away, and so forth.
Right. I probably meant more readers than scholars.
Readers. Yes, of course, because in the West, readers are scholars. Thank you, Zarina. This was a pleasure. I don't think anything I said is actually in my book.
So anyone who wants to read Yelena's book, it will be available from Globus. It's available elsewhere. You can contact us. We can send you the right way. And this book now is coming with the talk, and you can watch it again. You can recommend it to others. You can buy some of the books, and it could be a good gift package along with a talk for your loved ones who are interested in Russian literature and literature in general. Or you can just take it back home and think about it, what you've learned today. Thank you so much for being with us. Yelena, thank you for your brilliance. And dear audience, thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. It's very valuable to us. We are going to take a short break till January. And in January, we're going to start on the whole series of talks, literary translation roundtables, poetry readings, culinary shows, children's books readings. And if you have an idea for something, contact me. I'm always open for ideas and looking for new and exciting projects in the world of literature and culture. Thank you so much. Happy holidays, and thank you. Bye.